It really started in 1985 because that's when General Synod met in Ames, Iowa. That's the national meeting of the church. And they adopted a resolution, and part of that resolution was that churches could opt to be open and affirming churches. And I was there at Ames at the time, so I was very clear about it. It was a very slow process, and not much happened throughout the denomination for quite a while. It took a while for people to get into it. Don Treffinger was at the start of his time of being moderator of the church. He had been vice moderator before 2 years. And Jackie Tutt was the vice moderator when Don became the moderator. And we all talked about the process of open and affirming, and all agreed that we really wanted to do that. At the time, out of the 5,000 to 6,000 United Church of Christ congregations, I think about 350 churches had taken that step. There were about 4 or 5 in the Florida conference, which was about 100 churches. So really, we began by bringing it up in the church council and asked permission to start the process of talking about it. The other thing that happened early on was Joe Evans was here by then as former president of the denomination, and Joe had a lot of friends, and one of the friends that came to visit him was the current conference minister of the Connecticut conference. And we began talking about the open and affirming process because we were entering into it. And her advice was, it really goes well in every church that takes 2 years to do the process. Takes their time. I have had churches in the conference that decided this is the right thing to do, and often it was the minister who said this is what we should do and we should do it now. And often there was trouble in the church, and it hurt the church long term. We talked about that in the council meeting, and I brought that up, and we made a decision that we would take our time doing it. We wouldn't rush into it. We did some educational stuff. There were 3 major meetings we had as a congregation, and invited everybody to stay after church. One of them was, we had a psychiatrist, John Kiefer, who was a very good psychiatrist in town. He talked about the whole physical process, and he was wonderful about it. He was just brilliant and answered a lot of people's questions. We also brought in a minister from a church that had become open and affirming, which was St. Andrew's, which, interestingly enough, it was in an interim between ministers, and the interim minister, Don Henderson, who lived in Sarasota, was a member of the church, and they had done it in about 6 months. And bells rang in my head, and I remembered what had been told me, but he was very good about the theological implications, what the Bible had to say. He'd gone through it, and he was very clear about it. That was also very helpful. And the third person we brought in was Bill Johnson. He told some of the stories about that time, which were very difficult to hear about, the prejudice that had followed him and so forth. But all those things were very helpful. I did sermons periodically during that time. Sometimes we wrote articles in the newsletter. We obviously established a committee that you know about, and Kathy and I have been talking about this. And Tom Anderson, that he was interesting, and I remember him because he wanted us to have a Bible study at his house for people that he thought might be opposed to the process. I would go to his house and we'd do the Bible study. And in fact, he did include people who eventually did not stay with the church. So it's somewhere between, it would have been sometime between 2000 and 2001, we would have named the committee in that. We ended up having 2 families who left the church over the issue. We took a vote then at the annual meeting, and I believe it was 2002. When we finally took the vote, there were more than 100 people there, but the vote came out to, I think it was 103 in favor and 1 opposed and 1 abstention. I think it says a lot about the congregation that we did that well. We advertised it. We put it on all the bulletins and newsletters that we were an open and affirming. I understand we were approximately the 400th church in the denomination. That means we were about 6th or 7th in the Florida conference to do that. You asked about, did we have any guidance from the denomination?
Right.
They produced a book. We used it extensively, almost exclusively, and followed the process that they gave us. I was just very pleased with how it all went. I said it was not divisive really in any way. It seemed like it was going to be at the beginning, but it certainly was not.
I have been minister of music at the church since 1989. I had originally, that was a part-time position, and I think around 2000 that became a full-time position for me. So I was full-time staff member as minister of music when the church went through the process of becoming open and affirming. And I remember, I wasn't real actively involved in that, but I do certainly remember that I feel like that whole process was pretty driven by the denomination and certainly the UCC Florida conference at that point. It was one of the causes that they were really promoting, much as they are promoting racial justice causes today. I felt like the UCC was really promoting churches to become open and affirming. And of course, we had leadership at that point, and our senior minister, John Seister, who was all about inclusion, and that was high on his priority. And the moderator at the time was Jackie Tutt, who also was highly inclusive of all people. And so I think they were the driving force behind opening up this process. I know that leading up to that, there was a general attitude in the church that, well, why do we need to go through this process? We already are open and affirming. And yet the leadership said, you know, we need to bring everybody on board and be careful to educate. And so I remember they did a series of luncheons after church in Seister Hall, where they brought in various guest speakers. I think that there was, to my recollection, there was even a very conservative biblical scholar to talk about the biblical scriptures that did not support this, as well as a more progressive biblical scholar. They had lunches around this, and each lunch had a guest speaker that would speak to our congregation. And so when the vote came about, I felt like the congregation was really on board, and I don't remember much opposition to it at all. I do know that we lost a couple families because of that vote. And I remember thinking, you know, where have you been all along in this church? Because it had been kind of presented to us in many ways in worship and from the pulpit, certainly, and from this whole process that had been so carefully constructed and implemented. I did a interesting exercise in preparing for this interview in that I had saved a lot of our pictorial directories throughout the years. And so I took, you know, a little time to just thumb through those. And the earliest ones really had very few identified LGBT people. Scott Nutter was one of our early members. He was always a rock. And some of you might remember the name DeForest Cole. And they were really the only two in some of those early directories. In 2002, there was a directory made, and I think that was probably after the open and affirming vote. And some of our members were showing up, like Wally Beckstrom and Jim Whitliff and Eugene DeClark, certainly Ross Elwood and David York, Dick Howard, you might remember, Neil Linder and Boyd Alibi were in there, but their pictures were all separate. There were no pictures of couples in that directory in 2002. And then by 2007, 5 years later, when the next directory came out, those couples were there pictured together. Neil and Tom and Dale and Steve, and I think Sarah and Barbara might have been in the next directory, but anyhow, we started to see couples pictured together. And I thought that was very interesting in the whole evolution of this process.
You know, I had been in the church so long, and I was even there before John Seister. And I think, you know, I was on so many different committees. I don't think there was hardly anything I wasn't a part of in a way. And Scott Nutter and I were always decorated the church for Christmas. Scott was there every single Sunday, and we would look at each other and smile as our connection. So I was close with Scott. We had a good time. And so when ONA came on, he was part of the committee, and somebody wanted me to be the chair. And I said, I don't want to be a chair alone. And so I'd look, Scott was right next to me, and I said, you want to co-chair? And he said, okay. So we are co-chairs of Open and Affirming Committee. I think the person that was probably got John Seister into it was Edie Sanders. She was really gung-ho. I don't know whether she came from another church that was ONA or what, but she really wanted to make First Congregational ONA. And I think John Seister was for it. And so we started the committee. She was the one that wanted to push it real fast, and John Seister just rejected that thought. We were going to do this very slowly and gradually to bring in the congregation bit by bit. And of course, John Seister was a great leader with it all, so he knew how to go about it. One thing we did, if you look at the history of the church here, this thing, we started a breaking of the bread together and organizing informal dining, and we'd go to each other's houses, and there'd be a group. And we'd sit around and have our dinner. And I think John Seister was a part of almost all of those. And of course, this inclusiveness kept coming up, you know, because by going to each other's houses, you became more inclusive. And, you know, it was warm and wonderful. So you learn more about people that way. So I think that may have been a little easing into it, the way they tried to get people to be more open about everybody in the congregation. So I think that might have been, again, a John Seister idea, you know, to kind of ease things in.
Well, I first became involved with the Open and Affirming I was a deacon, and John Seister said, last Sunday, Edie Saunders, when she was going out, said to me, is this church open and affirming? And everybody just kind of looked at everybody and said, no, it isn't. And people didn't quite understand what open and affirming was. We just started holding meetings, interviewing various members of the church and discussing what open and affirming meant to them. One couple, deacons of the church, who were big supporters of the church, had a gay daughter, and they who had a girlfriend, and they, one of our meetings said, you know, we accepted our daughter as being gay, and we've accepted her girlfriend as just like another member of our family. And that's what we feel that the church should be.
Bill has a gay son. You know, Bill had to go through that process of also accepting gays. He had a family with 4 boys. And would you say you were homophobic?
I was quite homophobic, yes. Yeah, my son called up and he said, geez, Dad, I have something I got to tell you. I said, okay. So he went on and told me that he was gay. we chat for quite a while, and a very nice, friendly conversation. And finally, I told him,
You said, I loved you when I
Yes, ma'am,
answered
yeah.
the phone, and I love you now. We started attending PFLAG meetings only to help other people who hadn't quite come to accepting the gay person in their family. And we ran into a lot of families that didn't want anyone else in the family to know, that kind of thing. And at that time, the minister of our church wanted to start an open and affirming committee. And naturally, we got involved. And so that we were carrying that to Sarasota with us. And Dr. John knew that and asked us to be on the committee. We had a series of small meetings to talk about this. And I remember one man who was very negative. He didn't like those people. And that was very hard, sitting in a meeting with someone like that. But that was one person out of all the meetings we attended.
Mhm.
And the idea was to have as many small group meetings so that we could get to the whole congregation about this, and then have the vote so that people could say whatever they wanted to say, ask what they needed to know. In fact, I think we were crushed that it wasn't 100%, but we were jubilant that we got down to such a small number. Right afterwards, I remember looking up at the front of the altar when they were bringing the collection up, and 2 or 3 of the people doing that were gay. In the choir, we had gay men. We didn't know any of the women because I think it was Sarah and Barbara that encouraged women to finally be open. Our church was really working because of the gay community that we had. And we all commented on that. Oh, how lucky we are.
I think that important decision, what it did for us was move us from a commitment we had as a congregation and something we had lived and expanded, certainly in my 8 years here, into recognizing that the covenant is really a call from God and a promise we're making to God. We believe that God is calling us to that work. And so I think covenants in that sense are not just statements up here, but in our heads, but they sink down into our hearts and can really guide the whole way we go about our ministry. I think of the things that Collage is doing now to live the covenant, from the wonderful lunches that are now resuming, to the Zoom conversations that are continuing, to, I believe, looking forward to Pride Month in June and celebrating, or recognizing Transgender Day, or all the ways I believe that we as a church can embody and embrace those words in thoughtful ways. So a covenant sort of takes it beyond words of that we say or that we voted on, I believe, to bringing God into this, and where is God guiding us in the future. These aren't just words on a piece of paper or ideas we're going to embrace or talk about in a worship service. We are going to try to I love that image of encourage ourselves to live these covenants. How are we going to do this in ways that reach out beyond our walls?
Good morning, church. I'm Lynn Woodman. 20 years ago, our church voted to become an open and affirming congregation. That is, one in which our LGBTQ sisters and brothers would be welcomed and embraced. And on March 13th, at its most recent meeting, our church council adopted our inclusion covenant, which was created by members of Collage. Jerry Oliver and Pauline Geary co-chair Collage, and they are here today to share that covenant with you.
We of the First Congregation United Church of Christ in Sarasota, Florida, by vote of our church council, commit to God and one another our covenant with our lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer, pansexual sisters and brothers, as well as with those who still seek their gender identity. As we celebrate the diversity of the people of God, we commit to remain an open and affirming congregation that welcomes all our LGBTQ brothers and sisters with love and support. We will be a place in which they can be fully themselves and where their full selves are embraced.
We honor the vision of those in our congregation who, more than 20 years ago, founded Collage, Coalition of Laity for Lesbian and Gay Equality, to provide support for LGBTQ persons in the congregation and community. In league with Collage, we will continue to reach out to and welcome LGBTQ persons into our church family. We will serve as a refuge from hurtful words and harmful actions too often directed against them. This covenant statement is hereby adopted this 16th day of March, 2021, by unanimous vote of our church council.